Started with China, and it looks like it did end with China. And the reason why, because notice that the moment that President Trump left China, everything changed since that day. So probably it started because of China. The U.S. got the concessions it needed, and then China yielded whatever it yielded, and now we have those results.
都以为结束伊朗危机的是导弹和航母，结果一位美国能源专家却给出了完全不同的答案。他直言，真正让局势降温的不是美国，也不是以色列，而是中国。因为中国主动减少伊朗石油进口，让伊朗最重要的经济命脉受到影响，最终不得不重新回到谈判桌。这番观点一出，连不少美国网友都直呼，从来没想过能源竟然比导弹还厉害。
Anas, what do you think of the MOU and the energy markets? I'm actually genuinely curious to see what you think, because you've helped me analyze everything in the region from the beginning of the war, from the early days. I remember our first conversation talking about how China plays a big role in the decision to start the war. Us talking about it, that got a lot of traction. People started talking about X. So you helped me from those days, making sense of the reasons for the war, then trying to make sense of different events that happened throughout the war. Now we have an MOU, which seems like significant concessions in Iran's favor, significantly negative for Israel. And it just seems like it's turning a new chapter for the region, for Iran, for Israel, not for the US, but for American relations with the region as well. So I'd love to get your kind of a brain dump from you. What do you make of everything?
I'm glad you started it this way, because like you said, it started with China, and it looks like it did end with China. And the reason why, because notice that the moment that President Trump left China, everything changed since that day. So probably it started because of China. The U.S. got the concessions it needed, and then China yielded whatever it yielded, and now we have those results. This is significant on several fronts. So it's not really yielding to Iran as much as to China. Couple of things here to pay attention to, that if it wasn't for China, oil prices would have been above, I'm talking about Brent, the futures, Brent would have been above 120 instead of 75 and 80. It's China that lowered the price significantly. They've been playing this game for a long time, but this time they played it big time. They reduced their imports by 5.8 million barrels a day. That was alone a major decline in global oil demand, and that lowered the prices and continued to force them down. And I think that played a role in the various things that the Trump administration wanted.
So now let me go back to your first statement, which I found very interesting. You said the war started with China, and if anyone wants to hear us talk about this, they should go back to our first episode we ever did together, one of my favorite. And it ends with China. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So China, basically, President Trump visited China. We don't know that much details about the visit and what happened and what's secretly being discussed, etc. But all of a sudden, everything being toned down. Notice that the attacks on China, even in the media and verbally by the administration, etc., everything just being toned down. And since that day, we've seen the negotiations accelerate. Through whom? Through Pakistan. And Pakistan is supported by whom? Supported by China on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other. Most of the big projects in Pakistan basically are Chinese projects. And these did not happen through Oman, did not happen through India or any other country. So in a sense, China was present in the negotiations, whether we like it or not, and the Saudis were present in the negotiations, whether we like it or not. And the idea here is he went to China, something happened there. Since that time, everything started moderating, whether the Iran war, the Hormuz Strait thing, the number of ships start going through. Immediately after he left China, basically, we start seeing more ships going through the Hormuz Strait, going to China. We've seen the US LNG going to China after being halted since February 2025. So there are serious changes going on the ground. And what's strange about Trump is he said nothing, which is unusual for Trump to say nothing about it. That shows you the seriousness of the issues that's being agreed on or discussed.
When you did this, I'm like something on my mouth. I started looking at my mouth if there is something there.
I mentioned he said nothing, so that's very strange for.
Well, let me ask you more, because I know you always have more going on. Like, you're thinking about more reasons. What do you think happened in China in that meeting?
I think there were several issues being discussed. Of course, whatever I'm going to say, this is just my thinking based on what I see in terms of public evidence. It has nothing to do with anything else. I think it has to do with Iran. That's the first one, because there are indications that, toward the end, Iran was hitting really hard in terms of the level of weapons they used and the level of accuracy. And the question that's been asked even by the U.S. media, whether China is involved in that, in those operations in one way or the other. And probably that affected Israel more than anything else at that time. So I think this could be one of the issues that been discussed about the military support during this war from China. The other one basically is Trump lost the cards that he has against China, or he can play with China. And we discussed this long ago on how he had the LNG card. He lost it because China stopped importing LNG. He had the oil card. China stopped importing oil from the United States. So he lost some of those cards. So the leverage basically is no longer there. And then they worked on ethane, which is a gas that's been exported to China. And China, when they felt that they have the rare earth, remember that at that time there was this kind of trade war about rare earth, etc. They work a deal, but China basically was afraid that the deal will fall apart. So what they did, ethane is a gas, is used in petrochemicals. And naphtha is an oil product that is used in petrochemicals, and it can replace ethane. So what happened is China started preparing for getting rid of US ethane completely. And they start importing more naphtha. So in a sense, Trump started losing those cards, and his position became weaker and weaker in this case. So they needed to work something out. There are other things that being surprising to the administration. There are always concerns about China's drilling in East China Sea, etc., in that area. And the Chinese went, drilled, got the oil, increased their oil production, gas production, etc. And the administration basically felt they are completely helpless trying to control that. So in a sense, China had many cards to play, and Trump has some cards, but he started losing them one after the other. The other thing is, which is of concern, is China's EV sale, that electric vehicle sales to Europe and to Canada. And I think that played a role. The issue is not only the control or the damage they are going to cause to the Western auto industry. The fear was, if you are going to buy your cell phones from China, if you are going to get your cars from China, if you are going to get your EVs from China, and each one of them could be eavesdropping on everyone. And therefore, they can take pictures, they can record everything, not only on officials, basically, even on regular Americans. Because what people do not realize is that even in China, the Teslas that been made in the United States before they start making them in China, they were banned from parking. If you work for the Chinese government, you cannot park your American-made Tesla in the official parking of the ministry or whatever government organization, because the Chinese were aware of this technology.
Oh, wow. They're ahead. If that's not a warning, I don't know what is. I want to go back to the first point you made. You were talking about how Trump lost the cards with China, and you talked about the LNG and the oil cards. Can you just, sorry, I'm not as sharp as I usually am. What did you mean he lost those cards? How did he lose the LNG card and the oil cards with China?
Well, he thought, when he bargained with China, that China really needs the LNG, and they cannot live without LNG. And therefore he told them, okay, I'm going to hold onto that LNG unless you do this for me.
Okay.
And then,
Is that
well, they said, what
American?
the heck?
You're talking about the Strait of Hormuz closure in Qatar or American LNG exports?
No. That's way before. I'm talking about way before. This is China was importing LNG from the United States. The Trump administration and President Trump thought that China cannot replace LNG from the United States, and therefore they said, well, they thought in the trade negotiations they can use that as a card. But China basically immediately said, "What the heck? I don't need it."
And where did they get the alternative from?
Well, from Russia.
Wow. And then oil, same thing with oil, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is where, now I understand. I'm putting the pieces together. So before this war, the war with Iran, and let me know if I got it right, Doctor. So before the war with Iran, Trump was trying to get more leverage over China. And we saw that in the trade war. China had the biggest leverage, not the only one, but the biggest lever was the rare earth refining. So Trump had the gas, no longer had the gas. He had the oil, or he thought he had the oil. He no longer had it because of the mess up with the Ukraine war, getting Russia on China's side. So then the Iran war started, trying to control the Strait of Hormuz to give him leverage. That obviously didn't go well at all. So he went to China with no leverage, with all the cards with instead. And that's why the meeting did not go well. And he came back. He had no choice but to end the Iran war. Did I connect the dots correctly?
It's not necessarily. I mean, he still has some leverage on many things, etc. But it's not as powerful as he wishes. And that's where it is. So I think he has some leverage. And he did not lose. I mean, Hormuz was so effective because one of the issues when it comes to Hormuz is the following. China was the least affected in the short run. The problem, it is catch-22 for the United States. The United States basically can literally block the Hormuz Strait with the U.S. force. But to affect China, they have to do it for a very long time, like 8-9 months. But 8-9 months, that would destroy the world economy before even reaching China. And that's the catch-22.
Yeah.
So they couldn't really affect China because China was, I mean, in our reports, basically, we focus on this in details. Every couple of weeks, we have a new report on China, what Chinese are doing. They were always ahead of the curve. They were always ahead of Trump. That tells you either they have direct communication and direct information, or they are spying. Either way. So if you look, for example, at when they decided to take Maduro out, China was 2 weeks ahead of that. When they decided to do the blockade on Venezuela, China was like 3 weeks ahead of that. So there are indications that they were always ahead of the game. So by the time basically the Trump administration said no more Venezuelan oil for China, what China was doing, China immediately switched to Canadian crude from the Western ports because it has the same quality almost from a refiner's point of view.
And they planned ahead. Same with the Iran war. They planned ahead knowing the Iran war was going to happen. That's why there were all the floating storage. Their strategic petroleum reserves were filled up. They've also cut their demand as well throughout the war to make sure that they could cope with the shortage.
Well, let me explain that because this is an issue. We have the permeables in the oil market who were spreading misinformation throughout this period. And they were really angry at me because I was bringing those facts and they did not believe it. And now we have everything in front of us. We've seen how everything worked out and prices declined, and their $120, $150 oil did not materialize in terms of Brent simply because they missed several points. One of them basically is that China declined in oil imports. What they did not realize is that a decline in imports from China is if that was the decline was 5.8 million barrels a day. That is literally a decline in global oil demand. So global oil demand, so if we lost, let's say, 15 million barrels from Hormuz, 5.8 alone were compensated by China. So that's number one. Then they said, well, that means they are using their reserves to compensate for that. Well, that was not the case either. They missed on that one. And the reason why, of course, there are several reasons. The first one is when China was building up inventories, and I'm going to make up some numbers here. I usually use 800 because that's closer to reality, but it's a made-up number. So let's say they were building up inventories by 800,000 barrels a day. That means they have to import 800,000 barrels a day and put them in inventories. Now, if they stop doing so, then immediately their imports will decline by 800 without affecting inventories, without reducing inventories, and without affecting consumption, because this is kind of a side thing. Then you mentioned floating storage. That was exactly the case. We have about 1 million barrels a day from floating storage. Why? Because all those charts you see on the web and on Twitter and everything, everyone posts, this is onshore inventories. They don't include the offshore.
For the people that don't understand, floating storages is all these cargo ships, all these massive oil tankers, VLCs, that were full of oil, that in preparation for the war, knowing the Strait of Hormuz would likely close, just in case, they all filled up oil and got out of the Gulf. And we had all these different tankers all across the ocean that were sitting there, and that filled a lot of the supply shortages that happened after the Strait of Hormuz was closed. So that's the floating storage that was done.
Correct. So when we report this, we report two categories. We report the storage that everyone knows about, and floating storage has a completely different categories. So China was using that floating storage, and that was about 1 million, which means that they can take that, consume it, without reducing their own onshore inventories. So that's another one. The third point they missed was that China in the beginning banned the exports of petroleum products. So if I'm a refiner and I'm exporting 500,000 barrels a day of products, and now I am banned from that, then I'm not going to import the equivalent of that in crude. And the fourth point they missed was the large increase in Chinese domestic oil production.
Really?
From South China, yes. From South China Sea or from Western China, etc. So the production of oil and gas, the story of gas, natural gas basically was an amazing story because the increase was very large. So they were able to do that. And that compensated for the imports, which means that they don't have to use the inventories. They can just use the production and consume it. So the level of decline in inventories was very limited until today, which means, and this is another card that China has, while the US SPR was going down, the Chinese inventories were flat. And as we speak right now, the Chinese oil inventories are almost 1.5 times US inventories. Yet Chinese consumption is way lower than the United States, but they have more inventories than the United States. So if we want to play this game forward, China is still a winner. But if you take this Hormuz crisis, let's say, to next January, then by that time, China start losing.
Well, the world, as you said, the world will also start losing.
Big time. And so related to that, by the way, related to that, we've seen a decline in oil prices in recent days, a steady decline. And people basically think because of the MOU and because of this oil that is leaving the Hormuz Strait. Personally, I don't believe so. I believe that part of the decline is related to the fact that we have a slow economic growth in several countries, including in the United States. And that slow economic growth starts showing up in the data, it starts showing up in the behavior, and therefore the demand is declining, not only around the world, but even in the United States. And those who are claiming that the US demand is at record high or etc., these are weekly data and these are estimates by the EIA. They are based on mathematical models. They are not based on reality. At the same time, we have double counting in the United States, which is kind of very interesting, especially in the short term data. For example, if you are a refiner and I am an exporter of jet fuel, and you refine jet fuel, you give it to me, and I store it for 2 weeks. That is considered U.S. oil demand.
Really?
Although I am going to export it after 2 weeks, it will be counted as exports later. But
Oh,
within
man.
those 2 weeks,
Numbers just
it
can't
will be
trusted.
counted. Correct. Absolutely. So it will be counted as U.S. demand, although the intention is to export it. So we do have a serious problem with the data. Of course, if you want to talk about how the double counting in the U.S. oil industry is just unbelievable, for your audience, just for fun, I'm going to mention one, which was one of the main issues for the EIA in the U.S. between 2017 until like almost a year and a half ago. A major issue. NGLs, which is natural gas liquid, let's say, or naphtha, it will be sold in the market in the United States and be counted as U.S. demand. At the same time, we import Canadian crude, which is heavy. So I am going to go to somewhere near Houston. I'm going to rent a very large storage facility. I'm going to get that Canadian oil, and I'm going to get the naphtha or the NGLs, and I'm going to mix them, and I'm going to end up with medium crude because the Canadian crude is heavy and naphtha is very light. So I'm going to end up with medium crude, and I'm going to export it now to the world as medium crude. So the naphtha all of a sudden being exported as crude, and the Canadian oil is being exported as U.S. oil.
Like it's when you see all those numbers, I'm just gonna question everything now.
That's why I mean, people. My job is at the same time is difficult and exciting at the same time. So I've been going through these numbers for a very long time, and I can tell you the frustration sometimes is just beyond imagination because of these things. But luckily, we are used to it, and kind of like we.
视频中的美国能源专家认为，当世界都在关注战机、导弹和航母时，中国影响局势的方式却完全不同，不是直接介入军事，而是利用能源需求和贸易关系对地区局势产生影响。这种观点也让不少美国网友开始重新思考，如今的大国竞争，真正决定胜负的未必是战场，而是产业链、供应链和能源控制权。数据显示，中国长期都是全球最大的原油进口国之一，每天进口原油超过1000万桶。占全球原油贸易的重要份额，而伊朗财政收入中，石油出口一直占据重要地位。一旦主要买家减少采购，带来的压力往往比几轮军事打击更加持久。这也是为什么视频里的专家会说出一句耐人寻味的话：现在影响战争走向的不一定是枪炮，而是订单。美国1年军费超过9000亿美元，长期保持全球第一，而中国更擅长通过贸易、制造业和市场规模扩大国际影响力。两种完全不同的发展路径，也代表着两种不同的全球